It started quietly, almost too quietly. One week, shelves across the United States were lined with familiar bags of Canadian potatoes, the same ones that had been part of everyday life for decades. The next week, they were gone. No warning, no fight, just vanished. Restaurants and diners were left scrambling, and customers noticed the difference with every bite. What used to be a $3.50 plate of golden, crispy fries suddenly turned into a $5.25 splurge. But it wasn't just the money that stung, it was the taste. Instead of the familiar crunch, plates came out with limp, uneven fries that carried a faint chemical aftertaste, the kind of fries no amount of ketchup could fix. At the same time, demand for food relief in places like Vancouver and Kamloops skyrocketed. People were lining up than ever before, with events drawing tens of thousands and handing out hundreds of thousands of pounds of produce. Meanwhile, Canadian farmers, instead of sending their best potatoes south, were sealing billion-dollar deals with Asia, shipping their premium crops halfway across the world. For millions of Americans, the potato had become a symbol of something bigger, a sudden fracture in a trade relationship they never thought could break. April 2nd, 2025. Without any buildup, without debates on TV or friendly calls to Ottawa, Washington flipped the switch on one of North America's quietest but deadliest trade moves. Overnight, a 35% tariff was slapped on every single Canadian potato crossing the border, frozen, or even seed. No exceptions. No warnings. One day, Canadian spuds were an everyday grocery item. The next, they were treated like luxury imports, the kind of tax you'd expect on designer handbags, not on the ingredient behind a plate of fries. The numbers told the story in brutal detail. A wholesale bag that cost $20 shot up to $30 almost instantly. Restaurants that had built their menus around Canadian potatoes suddenly faced impossible choices. Pay the steep new price and watch profits vanish, or scramble for alternatives that customers would hate. Either way, the pain hit fast. For everyday people, it wasn't some abstract trade dispute. It was right there on the plate. Fries that had been $3.50 jumped to $5.25 within a single quarter. Not slow inflation, not gradual price creep, but an instant jolt. And worst of all, the taste that defined Friday night diners and Sunday suppers had vanished, replaced with pale, soggy substitutes. The impact hit American diners and restaurants like a punch to the gut. Within weeks of the tariff, the difference was sitting right on people's plates. Small, family-owned diners, the kind of places where locals had been eating the same plate of fries for decades, suddenly couldn't keep up. Some tried to swap in cheaper domestic potatoes, but it backfired almost instantly. Customers sent plates back half-eaten. The fries looked dull, tasted bland, and carried that faint chemical aftertaste no amount of ketchup could hide. For restaurant owners, the dilemma was brutal. Raise prices and risk losing loyal customers, or shrink portions and watch diners feel cheated. Neither option worked. In towns across the Midwest, foot traffic started to dip. Regulars who had always ordered the same side of fries now began asking, "What happened?" And the truth was simple. Canadian trucks had stopped showing up. Every week, thousands of dollars in sales evaporated. One owner summed it up bluntly. That's $60,000 a week, just gone. For an industry already squeezed by rising costs, this wasn't just about fries. It was about survival. The potato, once a cheap and reliable staple, had turned into a symbol of economic strain. North of the border, the tariff landed like a hammer on Canada's potato heartland. For decades, farmers in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Alberta had relied on the U.S. as their biggest buyer. Suddenly, those contracts were worthless. Shipments that once rolled south by the truckload now sat in storage, too expensive to move. Some processors shortened orders, others canceled outright. For farmers, the message was clear. Planting the same acreage was now a gamble they couldn't afford. Many cut their fields back by 15 to 25% in a single season, not because of weather or pests, but because demand had collapsed overnight. That decision rippled outward. Seasonal workers lost shifts, truckers had fewer loads, and cold storage warehouses sat half-empty. In rural towns where potatoes aren't just food, but the backbone of local economies, the slowdown touched everyone. Shops saw fewer customers. Service businesses went quiet. Families that had grown potatoes for generations suddenly faced uncertainty about whether they'd still have a market tomorrow. The breakup wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no fiery speeches or TV debates. Instead, trust built over decades faded silently. What had once been one of North America's most reliable food partnerships simply stopped. When Washington dropped its tariff bombshell, many expected Ottawa to retaliate. That's usually how these things go. Country A throws a punch, Country B throws one right back. But Canada chose a different path. Instead of escalating a trade war, it quietly redirected. Shipments that would have gone to the U.S. were rerouted into domestic markets. Grocery chains, co-ops, and community programs absorbed the surplus. Food banks, from New Brunswick to Manitoba, suddenly found themselves with thousands of tons of potatoes to distribute. Families struggling with rising grocery bills were able to put dinner on the table without paying more. Remarkably, retail potato prices in Canada stayed steady, hovering around $4.50 to $4.99 a bag. While Americans grumbled about soggy fries and soaring costs, Canadian households saw stability. That wasn't an accident. It was the result of deliberate choices to protect farmers and consumers, not pick fights. For farmers, the shift meant fewer wasted crops and more local contracts. For communities, it meant jobs and food security. And for Canada, it was proof of resilience. By choosing pragmatism over politics, Ottawa shielded its people from chaos, while the U.S. was left grappling with empty shelves and angry diners. While the U.S. market was closing its doors with tariffs, Canada was busy opening new ones thousands of miles away. Instead of pouring energy into retaliation, Ottawa looked east and struck gold. In the spring of 2025, Canada signed a $1.6 billion agricultural trade deal with Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia. For Canadian farmers, this wasn't just a backup plan, it was a lifeline. Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Alberta, regions famous for their premium potatoes, suddenly had access to fast-growing Asian markets hungry for Western-style foods. Shipments of fresh potatoes and frozen fries began flowing to Tokyo, Jakarta, and Seoul. Even ugly Grade 2 potatoes found new value, processed into high-quality frozen products instead of being dumped as animal feed. The results came quickly. Thailand became a top non-U.S. buyer, while Caribbean nations like Trinidad and Panama also joined in. Back home, new contracts sparked expansions. In Charlottetown, a freezing facility added a processing line, creating 45 full-time jobs and boosting local potato purchases by 15%. The message was clear. Canada didn't just survive the tariff shock, it turned it into an opportunity. By diversifying exports, it reduced dependence on the U.S. and proved its potatoes could compete on the world stage. In Charlottetown, the global trade shift turned into something far more personal. A local freezing facility, once uncertain about its future, landed a major deal with a Japanese distributor. That single contract sparked a wave of investment, enough to build an entirely new processing line. Suddenly, this small Canadian city saw 45 new full-time jobs, not just seasonal farm work, but year-round roles in packaging, logistics, and quality control. For local families, that meant stability in a place where agriculture has always been the backbone of the economy. More jobs meant more money spent in shops, more business for trucking companies, and more confidence for farmers who had been staring at empty U.S. contracts just months earlier. Even Grade 2 potatoes, the ugly ones that once sold for pennies as livestock feed, found a new purpose. Processed into premium frozen products for export, they became part of a revenue stream that boosted farm incomes and cut waste. Local potato purchases jumped 15%, keeping more acres in production and more farmers afloat. What could have been a crisis turned into a story of resilience. Charlottetown proved that when a community invests in its own strengths, it can turn trade shocks into growth and feed the world in the process. A simple potato, once the quiet link between neighbors, became the center of a trade shock that reshaped two economies. In the U.S., prices soared, fries lost their taste, and small diners struggled to survive. In Canada, farmers faced sudden losses but turned crisis into opportunity. By stabilizing domestic supply and pivoting to Asia, they not only protected their communities but built new global markets. What looked like a setback became proof of resilience. The potato trade's quiet breakup shows that even the humblest crop can spark change felt across continents.